start off and say there's a fabulous biography of Edward Thomas, Now All Roads Go to France. And it has a lot of the circumstances of the Depression that's inside that fantastic Edward Thomas poem. And there are two wonderful biographies that would go along with the first two sonnets I talked about. One is called The Young Romantics by Daisy Hay. It's just fabulous. It's not only about Shelley, it's Mary Shelley and Leigh Hunt, and it's Elizabeth Kent and Mary Shelley's sister, and its premise is exactly the opposite of those romantics. The romantic idea that the poetry is written in isolation. Its premise is that we need more poetry festivals like this, that Miles's idea that people write in community is exactly borne out by the way the Romantics wrote in community. And the other biography is called Savage Beauty by Nancy Milford, about Edna St. Vincent Millay. There aren't that many poets who are also biographers, but I am one of them, and it's amazing to read the biographies of the people whose poetry you're reading.
What was the title of the first one, the Romantics?
Now All Roads Lead to France. That's for Edward Thomas.
Yeah.
And then Daisy Hay, The Young Romantics.
I have a couple of questions. I don't know which one you might want to answer, so I'll ask both, and then you can go in whichever direction you like. One is from the perspective of having been a student with Morris 100 years ago. I remember how often in workshop, he's a wonderful, wonderful reader. And I remember how often in workshop I would have done something really kind of nice, and I wouldn't realize that I had done it until he pointed it out, and then I learned to do more of it, which was great. You know, that's what you want a reader to help you learn. So my question about readers actually is related to what Mama just said. How do you experience that where you realize, oh, it's a sonnet. I didn't know I was writing a sonnet until someone else reads it. Do you still experience that the way I did all the time when I was younger, and sometimes still do when I don't know what I'm doing until someone tells me? I guess examples of how you respond when you realize what a poem, the way we used to say it was, what the poem wants to do, or how it wants to be.
Well, there's a lot of, there's always the sense that we say and do things before we have names for them. I mean, which is kind of what, in a very sort of simple version of what Maurice was saying and what you're saying. I mean, we do things and then later on we realize things about them. There isn't a person here who hasn't written a poem and then 2 years later gone, oh, so that's what I was writing about. That's what was going on in my life. Whoa. So we, there's an interplay with the unconscious and the conscious, and there is a way in which if you're too conscious, then the poem is only kind of, you can't sink deep enough into the voice in order to write it. It's not going to be real for you. On the other hand, knowing all of these things that we've been talking about, help you out of tight places. You back yourself in, you think, how am I going to say this? What am I going to do? And then you think, I can move this around. Or I can take heart. Shelley couldn't manage to get there. He was having problems. Well, if he had I can have problems too. And I can, in the Edward Thomas sense, soldier on to get to the end.
Yeah. I like what Molly said in her talk about the importance of proportion. And I don't know, perhaps listening with your ear to a poem helps you get a better grasp of how the various materials of the poem exist in proportion to each other. And that's somehow, that's kind of abstract sounding, but it's actually, I think, very important. And there is a perverse pleasure one gets in seeing how disproportionate you can make one feature of a poem and then tip it all back over with one little move, as Molly was pointing out with the Edna St. Vincent Millay sonnet. There's like, it's almost like it's top heavy for the first 13 lines. Then that final line re-establishes a balance, and that final line is enough to do it, even though it's so disproportionate. But we listen for that in poetry, I think, and it's a great pleasure.
I probably don't need that.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for your presentation so far. I have a question for both, hopefully. Somewhere around 1960 or so, when James Wright made his short turn away from formal poetry with The Bough Will Not Break, or whatever it was that piece, that volume, a lot of poets simply stopped, it seemed to be, a lot of poets stopped writing using form, not being informed by form, if you will. And I wonder if we think that there is now a drift back, the idea of rebel angel sort of thing, where there are more and more people that are considered to be a part of working in form, informed by form, if not always following received form. Are we getting back again as a body, as a community of writers, especially the big name poets? Are you guys all going, or are many of you going there? Thank you.
Well, as you can see by the examples of Philip Larkin and Edward Thomas, and certainly by my examples, there certainly is a sense of an admiration for all kinds of linguistic craft, and I do think that I think that wars create really interesting responses in poetry. I think that the Civil War suddenly created a violence in visual art, where you get somebody like Thomas Eakins, and then you have Thomas Eakins' friend, Walt Whitman, and you get, it creates in some ways the two great talents in American poetry, Whitman and Dickinson, and there, we think about the First World War and the poets' reactions to the First World War, and in the Second World War there was a different kind of reaction. And a lot of those poets were writing after the war, and they were largely men writing after the war, defining themselves as men. A lot of this is, how do men define themselves as men after a war when they no longer are these soldiers? I mean, this is just Molly thinking this through, because I've been writing and reading a lot about this. So. I do think that that there are reactions in poetry, and I think that part of Wright's reaction is, I'm going to define myself differently, and I'm going to abandon all that, and it's also a reaction to modernism, which was also a reaction to a war. I don't think. And then, of course, there's a lot of tussling with as quote unquote new formalism came back into, and someone like Dana Gioia carrying the banner for form in poetry, and then the language poets, you know, are on one end of the bell curve, and the formalists are on the other end, and there's a huge, great middle of plain verse, I suppose, at that time. But I think now, because of festivals like this, because of MFA programs, there's just a tremendous rapprochement. I think people write all kinds of things, but teach the craft. There is a way in which it's really terrific to know your craft. I mean, you wouldn't build a boat without knowing how to construct one. You don't bake a cake without having a recipe if you feel like doing it from scratch. It's part of it. That was a really long answer.
No, that's great. I think as someone who, you know, writes poems every now and then and also teaches, I have to figure out how can I approach this in a way that's going to serve particularly my young 18, 19-year-old students in a way that will be rigorous for them. And if they've had prior experience writing poems, it is, I hope this doesn't sound offensive, they've had a junior high or high school teacher that says, gives them an assignment to write about how they feel about some topic. How do you feel about winter? And there's no further instruction than that. It just creates an occasion for the student to write about a topic without any parameters on it at all. And I've found that putting parameters on the assignment causes a young writer to respond really well to the assignment, and it becomes a lot more interesting. I often say, yes, we can talk about these technical craft issues, meter, poetic form, rhetorical devices, etc. But we can also talk about this stuff in non-formal terms. So I'll say give an assignment to students and say, write a poem that's 7 lines long, 7 syllables per line. About it, and I'm not giving them the topic to write about. I'm giving them the structure from within to write. And is that formalism? It could be, but it's made up formal. It's not official formalism. In our workshop the other day, we wrote a haiku in which the syllables were made up of non-words, like e, oo. And we had a blast doing that. And that's a haiku. Well, we had 575 syllable count, but that's not official haiku. I like thinking of form and the various features of form. And over the years, I've learned to enjoy sort of playing it loose. And I sometimes liken all of this to basketball, in which if you had a flat space and a round thing that bounces, and a handful of people throwing this round thing around and bouncing it, they're not yet playing basketball. You need some lines on that court. You need some goals at either end. You need a backboard there. And certain things happen in the game when the ball crosses the midline, and when the ball is passed into the key something else happens, etc. So until there are lines drawn on the court, you're not playing basketball, you're somebody throwing a round thing around.
I just want to gloss this gentleman's comment from back here. Both James Wright and Robert Bly, who influenced him, had indeed been in the war, and Molly, just exactly as you said, and came out. Wright didn't come out right away with it looking for different form. Quite the opposite. He was an amazing formalist, but a second thing happened in addition to a reaction to the old ideas, or the old sense of the old fashioned that went before, was they'd begun to read a new form, which was the recently translated Chinese and Japanese forms, and it went into them to the point that they found a form there that allowed them to say something that they felt at the time better helped them say what they felt they needed to say. So it wasn't an anti-formal reaction, but rather it was a discovery of a new way of speaking that helped them say what was important to them.
I think always, there are always decisions being made about how to shape something, about how to shape what you want to say, and whether that's conscious, consciously imposed, I'm going to try it this way, and whether the lines on the basketball court are acknowledged, or whether they somehow or another are unconscious. All of this invites the notion of play into play in the poem. We don't play without rules. I mean, that's just that, and we don't play without roles. And it depends on how crisply you acknowledge the borders, the outlines, the strategies that you're using to play.
I would add just briefly, going back to the sonnet, generally, as far as I've read, at least Sir Thomas Wyatt, something to 1535 or 39 or so, is credited with importing the sonnet to English. This is just a sort of personal theory. I think part of his attraction to going over to Italy and learning about the sonnet and then bringing it back to see if it will work in English is a kind of a response to a kind of cultural inferiority that Wyatt must have felt about the English language itself, because at the time the language of court was either Latin or French. These were the established kind of highfalutin official languages of art and state and all of that. And Wyatt, who's sort of a country boy, and spoke this Kentish accent, which God knows what that sounded like. But he's trying to see if our good old English, this uncouth and ill-mannered tongue spoken by brutes, according to European sensibilities, can we put this sonnet in our own tongue? And some of his attempts are very rough, especially metrically, and he's not particularly tied to 14 lines all the time. And I think perhaps we had a similar inferiority complex in America, especially as the Civil War comes along and kind of fractures the idea that our country is sort of extended England culturally, or extended mainstream Europeans aesthetics. And Whitman comes along and realizes we have to have an aesthetic that is a response to our actual identity, and we have to use American English and not English that makes one sound as if one were from England, right? That very formal idea of English. Whitman drags it down to an American idiom, and maybe, I don't know, maybe the tendency is to let that idiom float up every now and then, and something cataclysmic has to happen to cause us to bring it back down, and sort of like a dog that you need to retrain every now and then.
I just wanted to know how you felt about film and theater changing poetry. The one thing I see in the paper all the time that brings, I see a poem everywhere. When I see those 3 words, Je suis Charlie, sad, sad, sad people. But do you see any influence on poetry from theater and from independent films? Not television, but...
The arts are always influencing one another, and certainly events in the world are always influencing art. I don't think that poets process the culture very fast, and I think it's to our credit. There's a more of a slowness sometimes about the ways that poets process things. But I think that there's a lot of attention to poetry in the media. There's a lot of attention to poetry in theater. And certainly there's a profound sense of theater in poetry. I mean, I did a one-woman show on poems. I don't think that would have been possible even, maybe 15 years before I did it. The idea that someone would put together poems and have it be in a theatrical setting, I think that there's just a lot of crossover, and in terms of film, there are absolutely charming animated film projects having to do with poetry. There, and you can find them all over YouTube. There's a lot of, it's very, very sparky, and there's a lot of crossover, and the idea of infusing the visual into poetry and taking the image. That definition that says a poet is a failed painter plays on the whole idea of an image, and there are cartoonists and filmmakers who work in the short form that are responding to poetry. So I think it's sort of a wonderful time. I think the screen has been great for the poem.